Well, good evening. My name is Rohit Khanna. It's a pleasure to be here tonight as we stand on the cusp of the legalization of recreational cannabis in this country. And I have no doubt that tomorrow we are going to be a different nation than we are today. But tonight, as I talk to you about cannabis in Canada, I want to talk to you about not recreational cannabis, but medical cannabis. Something that seems to have been overlooked over the last little while, I would say. And over these next 7 minutes, I hope to give you some factoids, some statistics, some interesting perspectives, and some points of view. So, 18. What is the significance of 18 as it relates to medical cannabis? That is the number of years that medical cannabis has been legal in this country. Invariably, when I talk to people, they always end up being shocked. Most people think 5, 10 years. We are pushing 2 decades of legal medical cannabis in this country. Think about 2001 for a moment. George Bush was president of the United States. We had the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The iPod, not the iPhone, the iPod was launched for the first time. And think about this. The Earth's population in 2001 was 6.2 billion people. Today it is 7.6 billion people, which means that since our country legalized medical cannabis, the entire population of China has been born once over. So people always tell me, they say, wow, there's so many people on medical cannabis. There's millions of Canadians on medical cannabis. Man, they're everywhere. So I actually went to the Health Canada website and I pulled the statistics. There are 350,000 people on medical cannabis in this country, and we don't really even know if they're all using it regularly. There's probably a little bit less, to be honest. That's 1% of the Canadian population. And yes, the numbers continue to grow. If you use the same data source from Health Canada's publicly available database, you see that quarter over quarter, patient growth in the medical cannabis arena continues to grow at a quite staggering rate, 50, 60, 70%, and that's a good thing in my point of view. That means that patients are advocating for what they believe to be better treatment options. That means that doctors are becoming more accepting of medical cannabis as a viable treatment option. So when I talk to people across all industries and walks of life about medical cannabis, you know, our brains are wired a certain way. We think about 350,000 people and we say, well, we've got 10 provinces, we've got 2 territories, kind of that's probably about 25, 30,000 people per region in this country. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, 80% of medical cannabis in this country is driven through 2 provinces, Ontario and Alberta. And I'm not going to go too deep into those reasons, but suffice to say there's provincial laws and regulations and access to medical cannabis clinics and clinicians. But the uniform distribution of medical cannabis in this country is in fact anything but uniform. Now, my background is in epidemiology, public health, health policy, behavioral health economics, all that good stuff. So I'm an advocate for evidence, especially when we make policy decisions. And so I often hear people say, well, you know, there's no evidence for medical cannabis. Where's the evidence? What they really mean to say is that there's no evidence the way they want to see the evidence, which is a randomized controlled trial, double-blind, placebo-controlled, where we can infer causality between the exposure and the outcome and wrap it up into a nice, neat p-value. But there is evidence. Academics continue to publish thousands of papers. We continue to see more and more peer-reviewed literature supporting the use of medical cannabis. And let's be honest, it is very difficult to do a clinical study on medical cannabis when the very drug you're trying to use is illegal. The other thing about evidence, particularly in medical cannabis, is that we have evidence. We have real-world evidence. We have 350,000 patients over 18 years. We have millions of patient years. We have observational data. We have case reports. We have single-center experience. So we do have the evidence. Now, in terms of appropriateness of therapy, people will often say, well, you know, medical cannabis is predominantly used in chronic pain, mental health, insomnia, anxiety, PTSD, depression. And those are the 2 biggest areas where you see medical cannabis used. And they say, well, is it appropriate? Don't we have enough good agents to treat pain and mental health issues? And so I always turn to this algorithm that's on the Canadian Pain Society website. In 2013, medical cannabis was a 4th-line treatment option for the treatment of neuropathic pain, nerve pain. In 2014, the Canadian Pain Society decided, due to emerging evidence, that medical cannabis should be third line, right behind good old Mr. Opioid and number one, gabapentin, more commonly known as Neurontin. The interesting thing about gabapentin and Neurontin is if you look at the Canadian product monograph or the US product monograph, both approved by the FDA and Health Canada, gabapentin is not even indicated for neuropathic pain. It's indicated as an adjunctive therapy for people who have epilepsy in whom conventional therapy has failed. So if you want to talk about appropriateness of therapy, maybe we ought to start with the number one drug that people are using. The last factoid or point of view that I'd like to leave you with is really around this issue of prevalence. So we estimate prevalence as the measure of a disease in a defined population at a certain point in time. And there were these Canadian researchers about 8 or 9 years ago. They tried to do a prevalence estimate of chronic pain in this country. They sent out all these questionnaires to these households, and they asked them really neat questions. You know, do you have pain? How long do you have pain? Does the pain limit you in doing things? What is the intensity of the pain? How do you describe it? And they got back tens of thousands of questionnaires. And so they spit it into a computer model and they popped out a prevalence estimate. And that prevalence estimate shows us that anywhere from 20 to 45% of Canadians self-report as having chronic pain. Ladies and gentlemen, I mean, this is a huge number. And we owe it to ourselves to try and find treatments that can benefit this patient group. So, my last thought for the evening. I don't know where we're going with recreational cannabis. I suspect that it is going to be a very good experiment. And they'll probably have a few bumps along the way. But what I do know is that the legalization of medical cannabis in this country has been a tremendous achievement for patients and for clinicians. And if that's any indication of how well we're going to do with recreational cannabis, we're in good shape. Thank you. Good night.